Hello and welcome to Rajya Sabha Television. You're watching The Big Picture with me, Frank Pereira. A day after US Secretary of State Rex Tillerson told External Affairs Minister Sushma Swaraj that Washington was looking forward to further cooperation in the broader Indo-Pacific region, Japanese Foreign Minister Taro Kono told the Nikkei Business Daily that Japan would propose a top-level dialogue with the US, India and Australia. Swaraj hinted at the possibility of cooperation after meeting Tillerson on Wednesday. She said they agreed that they would work together and with other partners to promote Indo-Pacific cooperation. Prime Minister Narendra Modi is scheduled to travel to the Philippines in the second week of November to attend the 31st ASEAN and East Asia Summit, where he is expected to meet US President Donald Trump, Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe and Chinese President Xi Jinping, among others. On this edition of The Big Picture, we will analyze the possibility of a new alliance to counter China. Joining me on the program today are Commodore C. Uday Bhaskar, Director, Society for Policy Studies; Raviprasad Narayanan, Associate Professor, Center for East Asian Studies, JNU; and Sheel Sharma, former diplomat. Thank you to all my guests for joining me on this edition of The Big Picture. Ambassador, I'd like to begin with you, of course. Do you see a new axis, a new alliance being formed to try and counter a dominant China?
I think these are all old-fashioned words. Nobody these days talks about alliances and axis. What is most crucial is to talk about cooperation and peace building and prosperity. So what Japan and US and India are talking about, for instance, there is such a hype about BRI, the Bridge and Road Initiative. But Prime Minister Abe, who's just come back with a thumping majority, he suggested that several years back when he talked about partnership for quality infrastructure, and he set aside a very large figure of $210 billion. And Japanese role in infrastructure building in this area has been very well regarded. They have not been doing any things like converting debt into equity or controlling, or, there's not been any other interest in the case of Japan. For instance, take in Delhi, you see the DND, the Delhi-Noida bridge, which was developed a Japanese thing, and it is still, it's become a lifeline. So Japanese projects, or in Sri Lanka, for instance, they have done their parliament after salvaging the water body in the middle of Colombo. So Japanese have been doing this work, and Prime Minister Abe has been keen to do this. So there is prosperity building, cooperation, and at the same time, since maritime dimension is so crucial to all of us, actually our maritime ambience has been ignored for very long. We live in a maritime ambience. So to ensure that maritime security, sea lanes of communications, and an international order based on law and rules is what has a common interest of both of India, Japan, US, and Australia. So this whole idea is actually bringing like-minded people together for their common objectives and for building and enhancing synergy.
Okay.
So to call it as an axis or alliance, I think is a bit out of place in today's world.
Right. Commodore, we've seen the Japanese try and reach out to India, the US and Australia. We saw the Malabar exercise, which was conducted very successfully as well. Is Japan really concerned about the Chinese maritime prowess, and so is reaching out to like-minded people to try and secure its maritime future?
I would say that actually Prime Minister Abe, Frank, if I may, does reflect a very, very distinctive kind of maritime empathy. If you remember, the first time around when he was Prime Minister and he'd come to India, he spoke about the confluence of the two oceans, the Indian and the Pacific, and yes, gradually that became the Indo-Pacific. My reading is that Prime Minister Abe is conscious of China's growing maritime presence, particularly in the Indian Ocean. And I have a slightly different view, if I may, and I hope Ambassador Sheel Sharma will allow me to sort of expand on this, which is that while the notion of an alliance, as we knew it in the Cold War context, is perhaps not valid, I do think that after the Tillerson visit, his speech in CSIS in Washington, D.C., and India's own response to that, which is what you might call as the post-Doklam response, that there is a certain amount of, I think, overlap, a certain degree of correspondence between India and the United States for sure about what kind of international order they would like at sea, particularly the respect for law and customary norms. Now, this is shorthand for what happened in the South China Sea. Japan is very, very conscious about China and its own presence both in South China and in the East Sea for Japan. And Australia also has been a bit uncomfortable about certain Chinese initiatives specific to Australia. So what I'd like to suggest, I can get away with it on Rajya Sabha TV, which is that to the extent that the Chinese, and Ravi as an academic, you can correct me, they've been talking about the string of pearls, right? It's often said that China is now in Myanmar, in Bangladesh, in Sri Lanka, in Gwadar, Iran, Djibouti, that completes the string of pearls. Perhaps we are looking at a diamond that is comprising of the United States, Japan, Australia, and India. So is it valid to talk about the possibility of the emergence of a necklace, a diamond necklace, and that this is more a partnership where there would be a certain emphasis on connectivity? After all, India and Japan are now committed to the Africa corridor.
So we are looking beyond Iron Curtain is what you're suggesting.
Beyond traditional military alliance into a kind of flexi partnership which can be brought to bear if an exigency arises. And I constantly say that in the Indian Ocean, who is threatening the stability of the sea lines of communication? It's not the pirates. It's really about how the major powers, which is India, China, United States and Japan, are going to arrive at some kind of, perhaps a consensus again. How will order be maintained and what will be the contour of that order? That's the way I see it.
Okay. I won't call China the common enemy, but probably, the common irritant as far as some of these countries that have just been mentioned, Raviprasad, Narayan. Do you believe that like-minded countries are coming together to try and corner China?
Yes, but I would say that it is quite premature to identify this as a group against China. What is common to these countries is that they would be loosely, comprising what we would call a concert of democracies. And China is the other. That is at one level. At another level, it also shows the paucity of security institutions in Asia. You may have an ASEAN, and you may have many other expressions which mostly focus on the economic aspects. And Asia lacks a security institution, multilateral institution. Also, there are broadly inconsistencies in this concert of democracies because they're all, in the sense, dependent on domestic audience that might change their favorites at the hustings. So this is where we have to wait and watch, because right now we have Prime Minister Narendra Modi, you have Shinzo Abe in Japan, you have Donald Trump in the United States. But what after 4 years? Will this concert of democracies hold, or will there be new interpretations as to how these countries should handle China? And identifying China as the locus of banding around together, it does not make sense in the long term, because security institutions need a theology. And that theology is what is missing. By identifying China as a common reason why these countries are coming together, I would say is a very short-term maneuvering that is taking place.
Short-term maneuvering also, is it because, Ambassador, we witnessed the extraordinary rise of Xi Jinping. We just saw the Congress coming to an end a few days ago. Do you believe that that is playing on the minds of Japan, India and the United States?
In more senses than one, the Chinese rise and the kind of preeminence which Xi Jinping is now given, like the full banner photograph of him was really yesterday, which reminds you of Mao's times, and his speech, his 3.5-hour speech at the People's Congress, it didn't have many words to comfort us, or to soothe our frayed nerves. It talked about deterring war, not only deterring war but winning war. Now that language actually throws you back to the times in the middle of last century when people had war ministries. But as you know, most governments after the Second World War have changed the way they describe these things, in terms of defense, and you know, the whole what you call terminology has changed. So to go back to again that kind of a language, you know, Xi Jinping again, maybe I may be permitted to speak a little more. He talked about remember your red jeans to his soldiers, I think a few years back, and the way they say he is the chairman of everything, because he's become you know, head of state, head of party, head of military commission, whatever, the core leader. So while Deng Xiaoping, when he was a leader of that kind, he generally exuded a different China's image, you know, friendship to all and trying to work together. That image continued, and that image continued to bring China together across the world. But that image is changing today. So now in terms of security, you know, you only think about reacting, because if you think about proacting for security, then you become unnecessarily assertive. So when you proact for development and peace and partnerships. But for security things, you react. So in the case of China, it's steps like the 9-dash line in the South China Sea, or like the promptness with which China immediately comes back and says, well, Pakistan is doing everything it can on terrorism. This is just a day after Tillerson's visit in Delhi, and he said that Pakistan has to do far more. So this kind of a defense of their allies is also old-style power balancing, you know, and building of. So who is building alliance actually? This is the question. Then the way the Chinese are going about, as you mentioned, in the Indian Ocean. You see, if you see geographically, where is China and where is Indian Ocean? And still they want to come in here through Burma, through Pakistan, and through Bangladesh. This deep sea port in Bangladesh, what business have they got to do, or Hambantota? So these are the kind of things which China is doing, which raises our hackles. And this is not alone to us. This is not only for us. It's happening with Japan, the kind of relationship. And mind you, in the case of Japan, the kind of partnership which Japan has had with China, the kind of investment and the trade which the Japanese have had with China is astronomical.
Sure.
But that does not at all change China's approach to Japan. And
sure.
Look at USA, $1 trillion bonds China has bought in the US. But still, China does not have, you know, the kind of comfort in the relationship between the US, as Tillerson mentioned.
Right.
And the last point I want to mention, that Tillerson said that India's concerns are our concerns. That's again a sophisticated way of saying that, look, we are together.
Okay.
And when he said that we are shoulder to shoulder in fighting terrorism, he actually mentions that as regards India's main security concerns are there, America stands with India.
Okay. Sure.
It has to be seen how it happens, because it may be that when Xi Jinping and President Trump meet in 10 days' time or next month in Philippines, all this will be a kind of a build-up to maybe make China see reason.
Okay. You know, a couple of things, Commodore, that I want to raise with you. First and foremost, how much can we actually rely on the Americans to actually back us when it comes to some issues like this? And also, secondly, do you believe that, you know, Xi Jinping is going to be far more aggressive and, you know, in the Indian Ocean region and dealing with some of his neighbors like Japan and India?
I'll take the second part first, if I may, Frank, which is that I personally think that in his extended tenure now, he has a second term, President Xi Jinping, in all likelihood, he may be in power and really controlling China's destiny even after 2022, because what we have noticed now is that he has now been almost canonized, if I may use that term again, in the Chinese pantheon. And he is now on par with Chairman Mao Zedong.
Yes.
And he's also outlined a Chinese dream. This dream is predicated on what he calls as the two goals. One is for 2021, 100 years of the Chinese Communist Party, and the other is 2049, when they would be seen as a prosperous nation, which means that he wants to ensure that domestically there is no possibility of a Tiananmen or any kind of challenge to the party. Now he's become synonymous with the party. So his personal kind of, shall we say, aspirations and objectives are very clear. And therefore, to that end, it's very interesting that in 48 hours of being elevated in the way that he was, he spoke to the Chinese military, the PLA, and said that you must now not only become a modern military, but you must win wars. And as Ambassador Sharma has pointed out, it is this semantic choice, the turn of phrase, which seems to suggest a very assertive President Xi Jinping. My own reading is that he would be, I think, pushing the agenda of the Belt and Road Initiative in the Indian Ocean, where there are two nodes. One is Djibouti, where the PLA Navy and the commandos are already there. But let's also add that China is not alone. The United States is there, France is there. There are extra regional militaries, if you will, in the Indian Ocean region. The second is Gwadar. And that is where I think India is likely to be affected, because a growing Chinese maritime and naval presence in the Indian Ocean region is going to cast a certain shadow, which is detrimental in the long term to India, in the event that Doklam is the template. That if India and China are going to engage in the manner that they did, in a very prickly manner, as we saw in Doklam, then a heightened Chinese presence in the Indian Ocean is, to my mind, not favorable to India's overall strategic grid. Now, that's where the Americans come in. You know, your question about will the Americans back us? I think it would not be appropriate to expect that India and America would have what you might call as a convergence in terms of security interests. That only happens in a formal military alliance. And to pick up Ravi's word, that if you have a common theology. So, in the Cold War, the US led and all the partners who were hierarchically junior to the United States, it's US led. Whether it was Germany, whether it was France, whether it's Japan, they were following the US lead in the Cold War and even now after the end of the Cold War. I don't think India and the United States will ever be in that kind of a situation, because even when Mr. Tillerson was here, if you remember, our Foreign Minister Sushma Swaraj pointed out to Iran and said that we have a certain relationship with Iran, we have a relationship with North Korea, so obviously we have a certain divergence in certain issues, but yet we will partner. So my reading is that unless there is some very, very critical security exigency, to expect that the United States would back India to the hilt is not a valid proposition. But that doesn't mean that we shouldn't partner with the United States. We should still partner. And for instance, the United States and India are now engaging in the naval domain. So far, we've been doing exercises. My expectation is that after the next round of visits, when we have the 2+2, India and the United States can now think about joint operations.
Yes.
That is a certain movement in the protocol of naval, engagement. You exercise up to a certain point, then you move to joint operations which have a common objective. If the Japanese come on board, if the Australians come on board, then we are sending a very strong signal to China about how the Indian Ocean is going to be inhabited.
Sure.
That is, to my mind, where we are now proceeding.
Is China going to be really concerned about some of these signals? Because if you look at China, China has its own equations with all these countries, and their biggest trump card is the trade that they have with all these nations. So any kind of a partnership, do you believe is really going to affect China all that much?
Frank, looking at it from Beijing's point of view, the Cold War is over. It is over for us as well. But what has replaced the Cold War is something called the Cold Peace. This has been mentioned before. And the Chinese want to make the best out of this Cold Peace, because this is situationally, positionally, and also intellectually for them a very challenging moment, where they feel that they stand for solidity. At a time when you have the Chinese Communist Party and Xi Jinping running the show in China, it was the same Xi Jinping who assured people of the corporate world at Davos that China will continue on its onward path when it comes to instituting capitalist dynamics. So that to the Chinese is not a contradiction in terms. That is a logical progression. The same also comes to the United States. China feels this is that historical moment when the US is weak and is withdrawing from erstwhile theaters of the Cold War. And hence, as I said, what is replacing the Cold War is something called the Cold Peace. And China wants to be on the top when it comes to handling this whole situation during this Cold Peace phase. When it comes to India, I'll agree with Commodore Uday Bhaskar here. In very many ways, we are in a situation where, as I think it was Rabindranath Tagore who had said, "Ekla chalo re." We are on our own. We cannot abandon countries like Iran. We cannot abandon our own independent foreign policy. At the same time, we cannot be seen as piggyback riding some other nation's foreign policy interests. So we need to have our own unique voice. But at the same time, we know that China, well, we will have inconsistencies with China. And as Commodore Uday Bhaskar has mentioned about Doklam, I personally feel Doklam is just an interregnum. This is going to be replaced by maybe some other theatre, maybe with some other name. But we handle it. This time around, we handled it very well, very professionally. But Xi Jinping, who is in the second innings, to use a metaphor from cricket, it is very clear that he is here for a longer tenure. Because there is no second line.
As far as Doklam is concerned, there were some things that worked in our favor as well, because the Congress was around the corner, and also, Prime Minister Modi was to visit China. So all these things worked in our favor. That's not going to happen again, is it?
It involved Bhutan, third country.
Yes, it involved Bhutan, a third country as well.
That's right. Next time around, it will be more difficult to resolve issues diplomatically, because China has always followed a posture of incrementally increasing material in theatres where conflicts could erupt. Now, can we match that? I don't think we can. And then at another level, Bhutan is a republic. It's no longer a monarchy. So how do you, I mean, Chinese, they are effectively selling this message to the population who closely follows foreign policy. In this day and age, how can there be a republic that has outsourced its foreign policy to another neighbor? So this in very many ways has also made people in Bhutan aware of the fact that their foreign policy is dictated by another capital. So this is where the ground is literally being pulled from beneath our feet.
Okay. What's the way forward then? Let's talk about that. Ambassador, as far as India is concerned, are we to safeguard our own interests first and then look at any kind of partnership that comes along and be a part of it?
Well, Rabindranath Tagore was quoted. I'd like to quote Subhash Chandra Bose, who actually said that for his nation, he is willing to go and meet anyone. That was a kind of a strength building posture that he had. Now we have to have something like that, because all around us, our security environment has never been conducive, and the threats to our security it's not as though they have just come up. They have been persistent over the last half century. So when we have an environment like this, we have to go out to everyone and work on relations which work for our advantage. So to sit and to say, well, we have to do this and sit on principles, particularly principles which are actually casualties of history, we have to be very, I feel very uneasy with that. Secondly, take Bhutan, for instance. If Bhutan's republic thinks that it should not outsource its foreign policy to another country, then what about China? If it opens up with China, do you think the dragon will not swallow Bhutan? Doesn't Bhutan know what happened to Tibet? So, it's very easy for Indians to have very liberal outlook and say that, look, another small country in your neighborhood wants to be independent. But independent vis-a-vis whom? Vis-a-vis China? Look at Nepal, look at Pakistan, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka. Look at the way China is going about it. And it's not we who are saying. Our objections to BRI now are shared by Japan and the US.
Sure.
And look at what China has been doing in these. They are not concerned about the debt burden which will come to the people.
Okay.
They are not concerned about the economic impact of the infrastructure development. This is not the way infrastructure should be developed.
Okay, Ambassador, I'm sorry, I'm going to cut you short due to paucity of time.
And you think that these countries with whom we have relationship for so long, they will forget India, they will go to China?
Right.
So we have to at least have some balance.
Okay, sure. Yes, Commodore.
No, I'm just saying, you talked about...
Yes.
I keep saying, Frank, that the holy grail is the Asian century. The Asian century can become a reality only if China and India are able to work together, to partner and move ahead, which means both
do you see
sides,
that happening?
Exactly, they have to be committed to that. And that is where I think personally that from the Indian point of view, we should engage with all the powers to the extent that we can. United States is at the moment, I would say, the leading power that we should be engaged with. And to borrow Ravi's phrase, we are part of a concert of democracies. I think that's very special. China is not a democracy.
Sure.
China has a completely different worldview. But yet, we should engage with China hypothetically if China were now to come up with some kind of approach for climate change, which Prime Minister Modi is also committed to. I see no reason why India and China cannot engage and collaborate if there is a larger common good. But should we dig our heels in on issues like Doklam and where our territorial sovereignty issues are concerned? I think we should. So I think we should have the ability to really have the contradictory kind of tenor and pursue tracks as they emerge and partner in America, partner a Japan and partner a China if the window presents itself. And at the end of the day, we compete with China, we have differences with them, but I don't think we should be hasty in converting China into either a villain or an enemy, as our foreign secretary said yesterday in one of these think tank meetings. I think that should be the way ahead.
Okay, right. Close the show for us, Raviprasad Narayanan, with your concluding remarks.
I'll take over where Commodore Uday Bhaskar left off, and I personally believe that India needs to explain its foreign policy to a domestic audience as also the international audience, saying that it has very many layers and the levers that we have when it comes to handling our relations with the United States, with Japan and with China, with all the countries including Russia, and what India's position is when it comes to restructuring international institutions of governance like the United Nations. The Indian Ocean, when it comes to the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, you have countries like China that are shamelessly violating the UNCLOS. Now, what is India's position on the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea? Apart from being a norm player, how else can we explain how we are norm adherents and how China is not? Now, at the intellectual level also, India needs to put forward its case more strongly, because our foreign policy cannot be unidirectional. It has to be multidirectional.
True, true. All right. On that note, then, I'll call it a wrap on this edition of The Big Picture. I'd like to thank Uday Bhaskar, Raviprasad Narayanan and Sheel Sharma for joining me on the program and putting things into perspective for us. That's all the time we have today. See you again next time.